there's going to be a lot more suffering in the U.S. than there is going to be in China. And that's for a couple of reasons. One is that I don't think there's any question that the Chinese people are going to rally, around the flag, the Chinese flag, and support Xi Jinping in this, because they see that this was not initiated by themselves. This is like a foreign attack. It is an attack by a foreign country on them. And so, they're going to respond patriotically. They're going to be willing to tighten their belts because they're going to, especially certain industries are going to suffer. But they'll survive it, and I think the Chinese people will remain united. Now, it's a different thing in the U.S. Because this is entirely voluntary. It came out of the blue. There's outside of the MAGA base, those people that are just kind of see Trump as a messiah figure. I think the Americans did not want this to happen. They weren't asking for it. And if they start to see their pocketbook severely affected, over the next few months and years, they're going to be angry. It's going to be they're going to try to bring it to an end. And they'll support measures in Congress to do it. I think there may be legislative means to bring this to an end. That's a possibility. Or they'll have to wait for the next presidential election. I think there's just no question in my mind that the Chinese are going to win this war. That's just looking at one aspect of it, but just looking at that aspect, which I think is very important, you see that China has the upper hand.
Could you tell me what kind of negative effects this would have for China? The propaganda that's coming out of here in the United States is saying that Trump actually has all the cards because of this huge trade deficit. It's something 5-1. So that way, this is going to affect China a lot more because they can't sell their goods here in the United States. So all of a sudden, this is going to cause massive unemployment in China, and the people are going to rebel and throw Xi Jinping out of office.
Right. Well, that's not going to happen partly for the reasons that I just stated, but also it's just that the U.S. is just not in that dominant position that it once was. Maybe back in the 1980s when China was just emerging from the Maoist years and were, starting to build up their export industries. The U.S. was hugely important, and that was true, through the 90s and into the 2000s as well. But now that the whole world is catching up with the U.S. The U.S., like I think I said in a recent program, only accounts for 13% of global market demand. That's just not critical. Again, in that time, we find like the BRICS countries are growing faster. They account for more of the world economy than the G7. This is an entirely different world. So China, again, it'll be a blow, but it's not like there's a huge world out there, that they're already selling to, and they can work further to develop those markets. So, in the end, some people have argued that Trump always puts it in these terms, like, they're cheating us, and now we're going to, we're saying an end to the cheating. We're going to punish you. Go stand in the corner until you agree not to cheat anymore. That's almost, I don't think I'm really exaggerating the kind of language that or not much, not by much, the language that Trump uses. But, that's basically his thinking on this. And it's wrong. It's actually, you could even argue it's the other way around. China supplies us with cheap goods, and we spend money that we don't have to buy those goods. I mean, this is, who really has been getting the advantage, in this relationship. And now this is going to end. We can't get those cheap goods. What do we have? We just have we have the world's reserve currency. We can produce dollars and buy in excess of, of what we consume, in excess of what we produce as a result. But I would say, it just seems to me, I'm not an economist, but that these tariffs actually are going to put the U.S., its role as, the provider of the world's reserve currency. It'll put that role at risk. It already is at risk for reasons that we discussed earlier. But this is going to be a further do further damage to the reserve currency status of the U.S. dollar. Because that's the thing is that dollars are in demand partly because is in connection with trade, right? You sold things to the U.S. and you got these dollars from them, right? And so, you have to hang on to those dollars. And what the Chinese would do is they would, in other countries as well, is buy U.S. Treasury bonds and therefore support the U.S. economy and allow the U.S. economy to continue to spend beyond its means. But when you shut down trade, that whole cycle comes to an end. And it just seems to me that that's going to be do real serious damage to the U.S. dollar. I don't see how it can't. It's again I think the U.S. really the recent U.S. presidents. It's not just Trump, but it was true of Biden also, right? They're living in the past. They still think that this is like the 1990s or even the 1940s after the end of World War II. We can just the whole world depends on us. We can do what we want. Every other country just has to accept, our diktats and bend their knees. And it's just not, we saw it with Russia, and now we're seeing it with China. You're just getting a firm no. We're not playing this game anymore. We're not afraid of you. We can live without you.
I saw something just before we started the podcast that Xi Jinping told the Chinese banks to no longer acquire dollars, something like this. So is that the beginning of de-dollarization? Do you think that's happening, that's what we're seeing? And what will that mean for the U.S. if it does happen? You said it was already a threat to the world reserve currency status. So
right. Yeah,
what does that mean for America?
Sure.
For the world?
Okay, well, I mean, and most directly, if the Chinese are not going to continue to accumulate dollars, which they do in the form of these U.S. Treasury bonds, that means that we have to finance a greater share of those bonds ourselves. And what does that mean? It ends that, when they buy those bonds, they keep the interest rates down. They stop buying them. Then those interest rates start to go up because you have to draw in more cash. You have to make your bonds more attractive. You lose a buyer, you need to get a new buyer. The only way you can do that is actually to increase the yields on those bonds. So that, immediately it puts us in, it worsens our fiscal situation. We're already tremendously in debt. We're already, spending, $1 trillion on interest every year. And that's going to go up. We're already in a kind of a,
death spiral.
In a death spiral. That's right. We're circling the drain. That's what I was going to say, but that's just going to accelerate if you do that.
Okay, so then well, it sounds like, just continuing the poker metaphor, it sounds like we don't have a very strong hand. America doesn't. Trump is trying to bluff. China's calling our bluff. And we're done. And instead of, cash just saying, okay, we fold, we're going all in, right? That's Trump's only strategy, partly because he thinks he has a stronger hand than maybe he already has.
Yeah.
And also he just has this commitment. Once you've publicly stated that you're going to do this, it's really hard to pull back. It'll be a lot of egg on his face if he does. So I think most likely we're going to continue this. If we slap on more, I heard Kevin O'Leary from Shark Tank saying that we need to go 400% tariffs. We just go all out. And if we do this, you think that China is never going to fold. They know that they have the stronger hand, and that this could potentially completely bring down the U.S. dollar, the U.S. economy. Right? This could wreck everything.
It could be. We've been heading towards, our condition has been fragile, and we've been heading towards some sort of collapse of the dollar for a long time. But these trends can stretch out for years and decades sometimes. So I haven't made any firm prediction. It just seems like this, it's putting it at immediate risk. It will be sooner than it would have been otherwise, and it could be very soon that the dollar collapses. I'm not going to make a firm prediction, but this really is, has created a very perilous situation for the dollar.
Could we start to see hyperinflation? Do you think that's a possibility?
This obviously there are going to be inflationary effects from this because that's what happens when you impose tariffs, you increase the cost of imported goods. And we have been, to a great extent, been relying on cheap imported goods. That's one thing that's kept inflation down in this country over the last few decades. So, yeah, when you end that, or or you increase the prices of those items, a lot of them will stop coming in, from China. They'll come from other countries maybe that that don't have such severe tariffs on them, but there was a reason that we're getting them from China, right? We're getting them from China because that was the best combination of quality and price. That's what a buyer does. He looks for that, and then so we'll get some worse combination of quality and price. We'll get probably shoddier goods at higher prices. That's what's going to happen, or in some cases, there will be a domestic manufacturer that steps up. But I think, that is going to be a long-term process, again, because our manufacturing capabilities have been, greatly reduced. Our manufacturing sector has been hollowed out over the recent decades. That was a decades-long process, and I think it could be a decades-long process to build those industries up again. At least it's going to be years. And so that's something I talked about. It's just like, okay, you can say there are potentially some beneficial effects for at least certain sectors of the U.S. population. If we begin to replace, we go through this process of import substitution, we begin developing our own industry. But that's a slow process, and I don't know that people are going to have patience for that. And I don't even know how successful that's going to be, even in the long run.
Okay, exciting.
Yeah.
So we're going all in on this economic war with a losing hand, and it sounds like it's likely that we're going all in militarily, potentially with Iran. We've already gone in pretty far with Ukraine with a losing hand, and we saw the outcome of that. Yeah. We're seeing us being humiliated on the global stage, not even be able to stop the Houthis, and Trump's publicly posting war crimes about our strikes on the Houthis. It's not helping our global image at all. And then our military might, I think, is being definitely put into question. Russia stood up, and we were shown to be not as almighty as we thought we were. The Houthis stood up, and now everybody's like, well, we can't even take the Houthis on. What are we doing? And now we're threatening Iran. So it sounds like we're at this crossroads now where we are moving to this point where we are defining our hegemony on this. This is it. It's putting it on the line. Am I overstating it? Like our economic hegemony, our military hegemony, like this is what America is all about. Our power projection, our ability to boldly and dominate the world is now being put into question. We talk about people standing up. Russia stood up. Yemen stood up. Iran standing up. China standing up. And there was always this big question as well before, who do we want to lead the world? Do we want the United States to lead the world, or do you want a country like China? And it used to always be like, of course you want the United States. But thanks to our position in situations like Gaza and also with Ukraine and Russia, people are like, morally, we don't think we want the U.S. to lead the world either. So is that how you kind of assess the situation where we're at?
Yeah, obviously we're staking a lot of U.S. prestige on these moves, or at least the Trump administration is, Trump and himself in particular, and yeah, if he fails, and I think he's bound to fail, it's going to be disastrous, for him personally, but for the United States as well. I think that the U.S. reputation has already been severely damaged for the reasons that he gave, but it's going to be further damaged. Our soft power, which was really, a part of what made us such an influential country around the world, has really taken a beating, and it's taking a further beating now. I mean, like the 1-2 punch, the combination of Biden and Trump, the zombie president followed by the lunatic buffoon. It's just really, much of the world must be looking at it and saying, what happened? What's in the water there? I find myself wondering that too. I can only laugh, but I also want to cry. I mean, this is the country I grew up in, and I've loved, and I used to take great pride, especially when I was younger, in being an American, and it's just harder and harder to do that now.
What is in the water? Why are we doing this? It's just hubris. It's just some American exceptionalism that has poisoned our minds that much. Is that
Yeah,
What
well,
do you think it
that's
boils down
part of
to?
it, and we've talked a lot about that. But then there's just this general cultural degradation. I think there's no question about it. Just to give you an example, it's just like, yeah, Trump was boasting, I think it was yesterday, that all these little countries, their governments have called me up and they're begging, please, sir, we'll do whatever. Yeah, they kiss my A, that's.
You can say it, Dad.
Oh, I
Sorry.
say, okay. Yeah, I'm just wondering what our speech was. Okay.
I don't think we have little kids. I only have little kids watching. So
You're right. Okay. All right. Yeah. And it's not a particularly bad word anyway, but it's, but yeah, just using that kind of crude language is not something a previous president would have done, really. It's just, and there's a reason for not doing that. It's not just, okay, fuddy-duddy, silly, etiquette or something. That the president is supposed to carry himself in a dignified manner and speak respectfully. He can be very firm, and up to the point of even launching a war. In some cases, it might be justified. I think it's very, very rarely justified. But just to this kind of language is something that's heard, for example, by the Chinese people. And that just is going to increase a resolve to just hang in there. No, we're not doing that. It's just like this. We're not dealing with this guy. And just imagine, if you're dealing with somebody personally over some personal issue, and somebody starts to talk about that in a haughty manner, that you just say, yes, forget him. Even if that means some major economic loss, I'm not going to have anything to do with it. It is this hubris, but it's also this cultural degradation, which includes, this kind of really bombastic and crude talk, but also, increasing tolerance of war crimes, as we've mentioned too. I mean, all of these things together are they're very worrying signs, and again, the much of the world sees it. Unfortunately, like within the U.S., everybody tends to see things through this hyper-partisan lenses. So it's just like, they think, well, if we can just get the Democrats back. And I think if you step back and look at it, it's just like people see that the whole country is declining in different ways. And yeah, there will be changes in policies, but it's not all about Trump or just about Biden. It's both of these presidents could not have. Neither man could have been president, a couple of decades ago. There's no question about it, maybe even a decade ago. But that's the best we can produce at this point. This is what's happened to our political system and our culture.